So hopefully this doesn't backfire on me. Originally, this was going to be my motivational example, and I thought maybe it's too complicated. Maybe it would actually be demotivating and scare some people off. Um, I don't know. I'm not necessarily saying that you should do this level of work as far as advanced Python goes. And like all coding projects of any kind, it has kind of grown more complicated than I thought it was going to be. But let's talk about it anyways. So disclaimer, this might seem a little bit crazy and it might be a little bit intimidating. Basically what was happening for me is the intermediate Python module took way longer to create than I thought. And part of me is like, okay, how much of that was just creating the slides versus creating the Python examples? Because I feel like I can crank out Python code relatively quickly and then just talk about it. But having to create these slides was killing me a little bit. I thought maybe, but at the same time, I wanted to at least have like I thought, okay, if we're doing advanced Python, well, you could just live without the slides because you're supposed to be advanced now. But I thought at least having some kind of introductory and overview outline type slides might just kind of help it feel more cohesive. So I wanted to generate them in an automated way. Um, and so basically I'm trying to show a real example of how I would use Python in my life. Now you might look at this and think, there is no way that automatically generating a few slides is less work than just doing it by hand. And that might be true. But for me, I certainly enjoy programming way more than I enjoy writing. Um, and so this is a way to take a writing task and convert it into a programming task and make my brain like doing it more. Basically, I hate repetitive tasks. Um, Already kind of said that. Um, and the thing that was a little bit weird, this will seem maybe like a really small thing, but in the intermediate Python stuff, it was just kind of tricky to always remember, okay, what's the next presentation number? How do I make sure that my subtitles are consistent, so on and so forth. And so automatically generating something from Python means that I can get the code to handle the numbering, and it can be guaranteed to be consistent formatting. And so I also just think this is a cool example of the power of automatic text processing. So before I go any further, I want to show you this is how I generate these PDF presentations. It should come as no surprise to you that I would use a Python tool to do this rather than some of the tools that people typically use for presentation generation. And so some really smart Python people have written a syntax called a restructured text. It's part of the docutils module. And basically, you mark up the text in a fairly mild way. And then different people write different engines to kind of convert that text to either HTML or PDF or whatever. And there's people who do like a PDF LaTeX, just kind of document form. And my own website for teaching is generated using this, not surprisingly. And then I was one of the original co-authors to help convert this into the LaTeX form that does the slides. And so one of the things that happens is that whenever I have some kind of title for a section or a slide or a document or whatever, it needs to be underlined. So for example, this is the title of my disclaimer slide that you just saw. It needs to be underlined, and the underline must be at least the same length as the text above it. There's nothing wrong with, as you see here, over underlining, but you can't have less. So this is the title of my presentation, and that gets an overline and an underline. This is the subtitle of my presentation, and that gets this little tilde underline here. And then the different style of underlines represent different levels of title, subtitle, sub-subtitle, or section, subsection, sub-subsection kind of stuff. And then the author, so that information is what leads to this title slide. So here's the title, here's the subtitle, here's the author, and then this is kind of my own little settings file that must handle the Southern Illinois University Edwardsville caption and the little logo and the different formatting things. So I put this header in my Python text, and we're going to substitute in the title and the subtitle. Everything else here will stay the same. And then every time I want to append a slide, I need a title, I need to generate the underline, and then I need to put in the content. And sometimes my content, a lot of times, my content will just be a list of bullet points. And so I created a class of slide. So there's two classes for slide. One is a general slide class that just takes a list of lines that you want to dump to the text. So there are two slide classes, as we'll see in a little bit. One that simply takes a title, and then it automatically will generate for us the underline, and then it takes a list of the lines that we want written to that slide. The other is a derived slide called bullet slide or something like that, that takes a title, and then it takes the list of the text of the bullet points, and it automatically appends, or prepends, I guess, the little dashes for my bullet points. So this line of text, what I'm saying is this is all of the text that it takes to generate my slides, and all of this was auto-generated. So let's talk through the rest of it. I did my overview. I'm a crazy person. I would rather write really complicated Python code than just create presentations by hand. So the topics we're going to cover, there's some object-oriented programming. I would consider this to be advanced text processing. I would also file it under workflow automation because I'm going to auto-generate all the advanced Python slides. Again, the code, this is the GitHub code for advanced Python, and if you go here, there is a folder for advanced Py2, advanced text processing example, and then the main file is the slide generator.py, which we will look at now. So I have this header, which is a string, and one thing maybe we haven't talked about yet, you might have seen them as Docstrings, they're called, the little help strings underneath a function. But a triply quoted string, so you notice I've got 3 quotation marks at the beginning, 3 quotation marks at the end, can now be a multi-line string. And so all of this is one string, and the new lines will be kind of automatically generated. And the main thing to see is that it has a percent title percent and a percent subtitle percent. We're going to substitute in for those. And I mentioned that the underlining and overlining have to be as long as the title or whatever. So if this were ever really, really long, like longer than this, then it would screw up, and I would have to go back and fix that. That would be a good place to put in an assertion. I could know the length of this, and I could assert len of title is less than this, and blah, 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 blah. So this is my generate the underline string. So I take a string, and I take a certain symbol that I want to be the underline symbol. I get the length of the string, and I simply return this symbol times the length of that. And maybe multiplication of a string would seem a little weird to you, but if I said do times 5, it just means give me 5 equal signs. So that's how we're generating the underline. And like I said, so there's a slide class that is one of my 2 main classes. There's a slide class and a presentation class. And a slide has a title, and it has a list of lines. And it turns out that's actually a dangerous thing to do. I should fix that. Because if I ever did just pass in an empty list, that instance, it's part of the whole Python copy by reference thing. And so I wouldn't get, we'll not talk about that. I'll fix that later. You're like, but I want to know. So if never mind. I'm just not going to talk about it. Okay, and so to append the title to a slide, first of all, I make this unnecessarily complicated because I didn't want to keep writing. So, okay, so outlist has to get created. Okay, so the main method you would call would be the generate. So RST is restructured text. So generate restructured text, or gen RST, creates this list that's going to be the list of the text of the slide. And then it appends the title. And in Python, everything is an object, so I can just create a variable called out that actually points to this function. Every list has an append function. And so this is the function self.outlist.append, but I can call it without having to repeat self.outlist.append. I just repeat out. And so first I put out my title. Then I generate my so this is a string that is the return from this generate underline function, which was here. and then I append that, and then I put a blank line underneath the underline. So that's what append title does. And then since this is the general slide class, I just have a list of lines that can be written directly to the text file, and I'm assuming that the user has already kind of handled whatever formatting needed to be done. And I just didn't want to redefine out is equal self.list.append. So I actually call it now for the rest of the code, which is kind of inconsistent. But self.list.append the line for each line, and then put a blank line at the end, and then return that list. And then, as I mentioned, there's a derived class called bullet slide that takes a title, a list of bullet points, and then possibly some code that goes before the bullet points and some code that goes after the bullet point, or some text that goes after the bullet point, some text that goes before the bullet point. And so I save those things in my init method. And then when I go to generate my RST, I just call the append title function of the base class. And so you'll notice that this is all the text of bullet slide. There's nothing else down here. So since it doesn't have its own append file function, it gets it from what it derives from. And so we're going to run this append title function, because the title is the same whether we're doing bullet slide or not bullet slide. The difference is, so I've got this header, and I just put that in my list here if I have a header. And then for my bullet points, for each bullet point, I append a dash and then the bullet point itself with the %s for string. And I put that in my list, and then I put a blank line. And then if I have a footer that goes after the bullet points, I append that as well. So I can now generate two different kinds of slides, and I could obviously derive more kinds of slides if I needed to. And now I have the presentation class. And so, like I said, one of the things that was annoying was properly generating the subtitle line, and so now I'm specifically numbering each presentation, and I'll increment that number in the Python code that generates all my slides. I then have the title of the slide. The subtitle will be automatically generated. And then I have the list of slides. And this was where I used to have an empty list here, and I had that problem where that empty list then gets saved, but it's a specific list out in memory, and my next presentation accidentally reuses the same list. And so I was having my second presentation had all the slides of the first presentation and then all of its own slides. So the correct way around that is to just say, okay, if you don't either don't let the user pass in the slides and make them create them some other way, or pass in slides equals none. And none is a special Python variable that we probably should have talked about before, that just is a special reserved name for nothing. And for example, if you have a function, you have no return statement, then by default it returns none. And so sometimes you intentionally return none as like a way of throwing a mild error, and the user would check if the output is none or whatever. So what I've done is say if slides is none, then I create an empty list. And having an empty list here is different from having an empty list here. And you don't have to fully understand that, but if you run into this, just know that it's out there. Otherwise, if you did pass me in some slides, I'll save those. So I save my presentation number, I save my title. I automatically generate my subtitle as advanced Python, and then I'm substituting in whatever the presentation number is. And then I'm taking that header and I'm replacing %title% with my title, and I'm replacing %subtitle% with my subtitle. And now the presentation initial code is right. And then I have methods. For example, if I want to append a bullet slide, then I take a title and a list of bullets. I generate a new slide, like so, and then I append that slide to my own list of slides. Specifically, I thought that all of my slides would probably have an overview and maybe a topics, and so I made special methods that just take bullet points but have default titles. I also have the ability to append a general slide where I'm taking the title and the list of lines and generating a new slide and appending it just like before. And then I assume that all of these are going to have a GitHub slide. And so I want to link to wherever the GitHub repository is. If there's a specific folder I want to point you to, then I want to know the name of the folder. If there's a main Python file, I want to know that. And if there are other Python files I want to point you to, again, I'm putting in this empty list, and that's a bad habit that I need to deal with. I could just change that to none, and it would probably be okay. So then I generate the line to the clickable link to the GitHub repository, and I put that on the slide. And then if I have passed in a folder, folder is obvious or is optional, and not obvious, and the Boolean value of an empty string is false. So if there is a folder, i.e. it's not an empty string and it's not none, then I put in the name of the folder with some new lines around it to get it to space out correctly, and I have this weird 0.1 inch space to make it look good on the slides. And then if there's a main file, I append that, and if there are other files, I would append them one per line. And then kind of the main thing is when I get ready to generate my restructured text that I'm going to actually save to a file, first of all, I have a list. Each slide instance is going to know how to generate a list of lines for its text. And so I call that method for each slide. If it doesn't end in an empty line, I really kind of need a blank line between slides. So I force it to, if the last element in the list is not an empty string, I append an empty string. And then every list not only has an append method, but an extend method, where append would take an element and append it to the list. Extend, it takes a list and just extends the list to the existing list. So I want one big list that's the content for each slide. So I'm using the extend method. But when I'm done, I want to convert that to a string. And so I use the new line character to join that list together. And I think you've seen the join method in the strings module that was required. And then my total out string that's going to get written out to the file needs the header, which we have already previously generated, with a new line after it, and then this slide string that we just created. And putting those together makes my output string for the whole presentation. And so I save that. Then I want to automatically generate a file name, and so it's going to have advanced Python or adv underscore py underscore, and then it's going to have the number of the presentation number. And it might seem a little weird to use a decimal point with an integer, but what I'm saying is it must be 2 digits. So if I know that there's a possibility I'm going to have more than 10 of these, I want 0, 1 to show up as the first one in kind of like my file viewer thing, or when I look at them at the shell. So they'll be numbered 0, 1 through 9, and then 10, 11, 12, whatever. So 0.2 as an integer. All I'm saying is, 0.2i. It prepends a 0 if it's a single digit number, and that would be fine. And I think that's actually going to get truncated. No, it actually would still do it. So it's just saying must be at least 2 characters. And so, like I said, I want, when I look at them in my, what would be like a Windows Explorer, whatever that's called now, your file viewer, I want them to be sorted with 0, 1 at the top instead of 10 being ahead of 2 because of how characters are sorted. Okay, and then substitute in the title of the presentation, but that might have spaces and other characters that I would consider to be illegal, or I just don't like looking at them in my file names. So I then have a list of characters that I want to replace. And so for each of those, I'm going to replace them with an underscore, and then that's going to be my file name. And then the make folder thing might seem a little weird. So when I set up my code for the class, I had a GitHub place where I was putting example code, and I had a lecture folder where I was putting these presentations. And now I'm using the GitHub code to generate the presentation, so I want to copy them from the Git folder to the lecture folder, but I also want to create a subfolder for each presentation. So Advanced Pi 1, Advanced Pi 2, Advanced Pi 3, whatever. And so the folder is going to have the same name as the file name, but without the extension. So I use split ext to pop the extension off. And then I join that folder name to this lectures root, which I've defined up here as a very specific folder that will certainly not exist on your computer. You're probably not going to want to run this code anyways, but I built in a check on that. And so underneath there is going to be Advanced Pi 1, Advanced Pi 2, Advanced Pi 3, so on and so forth. So make folder is going to use os.makedir if the folder doesn't already exist, because otherwise makedir will throw an error. And then I copy to that folder path from the existing. So I assume that the file has been generated in the current folder and then is copied to its ultimate lecture destination path. And so I have a go method that generates the restructured text string, builds the file name, saves the file in the same way that we've been doing in the other text processing modules. And then if the username is rkraus, and it would be really creepy if any of you had that as your username, maybe flattering, but maybe mostly stalking. I assume I don't have any stalkers. So I assume that this is safe. It's only going to make the folder and copy. So you probably could actually run this code. And aside from the fact that you won't have this file, you could generate the text, you just couldn't compile the text to an actual presentation. So then, let's get ready to use this thing. So I start off with presentation number 1. And so I generate a presentation that is presentation number 1 that has the title Try, Accept, and Raise, and presumably you've already watched that one. And then in my overview, I wanted to have these 2 bullet points, so I do. And then I had a couple of hyperlinks. One was a link to a good tutorial, and one was a link to a citation. And then I wanted to give you my GitHub root that points to that folder as the main folder for this code. And then I generate the presentation. So this code is what it takes to auto-generate. I think I don't have it open, but I can. Whoops, sorry. I gotta go to my lecture folder, and then Advanced Pi, and then Advanced Pi 1. Yes. So try, accept, and raise, Advanced Python 1, overview, 2 bullets, good tutorial, underline. That's how you do a link in DocUtils restructured text. Citation, explanation, link, and then GitHub link, this, and then the folder. So that's all auto-generated by this much text, which in and of itself is at about the same level of work. I don't know, whatever. But now when I wanted to automatically go to the next one, I just say pres number plus equals 1. I don't have to think about what my presentation is. If I wanted to switch out which one of these was 1 and which one of these was 2, which I actually did, then I could just copy and paste some text and all that. And so presentation 2 comes from presnum, and then it has a title, and then it has a bullet slide with a disclaimer, and these are my 2 bullets. And then I have a list of bullets that go on my overview slide, and a list of bullets that go on my topics slide, and then I point you to my GitHub code where that's the folder and that's the main file. And so that generates this presentation with that GitHub slide, those topics, that overview, that disclaimer. So again, perhaps this just proves to you that I'm crazy and I would much rather write really complicated Python code than simply create presentations the easy way. And my claim would be that maintaining a large group of presentations and having them be consistent and not losing my mind, that this is actually easier for me, even if it's not easier for whatever a normal person is. Thanks.